Yeah.
This is Free Thinking on BBC Radio 4 and BBC Sounds with me, Matthew Sweet, in the middle of a discussion about the middle classes with Sam Friedman, Lisa Holdsworth, David Willits and Muriel Zagha. And now it's time for the science bit, but we're not leaving our theme behind. Published in the journal Nature this week, a paper that argues in civilizations, individuals are born into or sorted into different levels of socio-economic status, SES. SES clusters in families and geographically and is robustly associated with genetic effects. Now, one of the authors of that paper is Melinda Mills, and she's on the line. Hi, Melinda.
Hi.
Okay, so here's social class from a geneticist's point of view. What are those genetic effects that you write about?
Yeah, so before everybody gets excited or worried that we're going to say that social class is entirely genetic, that's not what this paper is about or what we're doing. So it was a group of sort of scientific omnivores that got together from the social sciences and genetics and statistics, and we wanted to look at these things. And remember that genetics isn't just about one gene. Well, in some cases for Huntington's disease or Mendelian diseases, then you can definitely have one gene, but it's often very complex. So it's not just about, so we study social class, you were talking about it, income, wealth, class, education, occupational status. This is how we've studied it. And so we looked at that. And there are genetic studies showing that there's a genetic basis for some of these things, such as education, occupational status, income. But it's complex, it's multiple, so we call it polygenic, so multiple genetic loci contribute to this. And it's also influenced by your family, by your environment, by the social policies, by whether you had access to education, by air pollution, by all of these different factors. And I think people have really avoided looking at this topic, looking at socioeconomic status and genetics because of Galton and this really repugnant history of eugenics. And one of our co-authors, Adam Rutherford, recently wrote a book on this about called Control, looking at this. So that's not what we're doing. I just want to say that. So let me just unpack it a little
yes,
bit.
do.
And if you're interested, we have a comic book version of our article as well. That's online, which is not common for geneticists, I can tell you that. Anyway, so our main point when we get, so people like Sam and others, with this social science lens looking at these kind of things, is we actually found empirically, and we've published it in Nature Genetics and also in the Nature paper, Nature Human Behaviour paper on Wednesday, is that genetic scores aren't just picking up genetics. And I think, this is where social science can actually contribute to genetics. So it's picking up genetics, maybe, saying it's 10% of your predictive value out of 100%, but it's also picking up assortative mating. So people, meet at school, they meet at the workplace, and all of these other things. It's picking up indirect genetic effects. So Lisa gave a great example. She was surrounded by books. Her mom was reading all the time. So maybe her mom didn't pass on certain genetics. She might have, but she created this environment for Lisa that has made her the star she is today. And there's other things too. So think about, we've got gene environment interaction as well. So that's all in these genetic scores. So let's say that I'm a woman in the 1900s, I might not have access to education. So my genetic score would be very low, but that's because I don't have access to it. But, whereas women in the later had access to education. So the genetic score would be higher. And then you mentioned as well what we call population stratification. So genetics is also about, geography, and it's about migration. So remember, we have, populations coming out of Africa and spreading, and we have these different aspects. So people often think, well, what are you guys talking about? But, genetics is about, there's this great article about genetics and geography, so it's very much related to where you live and who mates with each other. Sorry to use these words, partners with each other.
You're talking about the long history of humanity here,
yeah.
But we're inclined to kind of think about how this plays out in the present day. Can I attempt a very blunt summary of this paper, and you can correct me? That privilege breeds privilege, that economic capital stays within families, but so do genetic legacies like good health outcomes and good fertility. And you've found evidence for this now. Is that right? Am I right about that? Or
I wouldn't use the word good.
yeah, okay.
Just to,
Yeah.
just to make sure, because I could imagine somebody pulling that
Sure.
out. So it represents certain patterns. So so definitely. But what we're arguing, and what we can actually empirically show, is even the genetic things that we're measuring for complex outcomes, such as, let's think, it's not just about education or socioeconomic status, but think about type 2 diabetes or BMI. These are things that we would call diseases, but these are actually very behavioral things. So it's not just influenced by genetics or where you come from or your geography. It's also influenced by, the environment around you. Are your parents smoking? What kind of life, what kind of lifestyle are you seeing around this? And I think it's really important to talk about, what we're doing is sort of bringing in sort of a social science thinking into genetics as well, and saying, hey, look, it differs across time periods, it differs across different environments as well.
You suggest that we're now more efficient at stratifying the population according to genetic talent. Now, genetic talent's an interesting one. I'd like you to unpack that for us. But as I read this, I think, is this about the way we select our partners? I mean, the way that people date these days using online apps. We can select them according to quite precise characteristics now, can't we?
Yeah, well, this is another papers I've written also analyzing internet. So I like any kind of data, any kind of dimensional data. So I've looked at internet dating as well, analyzed that as well too. And that's also, it comes back to geography. So we have a great paper that actually shows, you might have certain preferences, but if there's nobody in your radius, then, you can't realize those preferences as well too. And I think it's just really important to talk about that, some things have a small biological or genetic component, but it doesn't mean that, we're calling for genetic interventions, and what we're calling for is that we need more integrated thinking about genetics and biology and where you come from. And it's often mirrored so I'm in a geographical area. And it might be that there's a higher genetic relationship with smoking or BMI or heart disease, but there's also higher incidence of those diseases, which are social and structural, and about, the availability of, healthy food or doctors or things like that. So it's really, taking a different lens and saying it's not nature or nurture, it's both of them together. And
But
it's very
what is genetic talent? Can you tell us what that means?
That article, I guess you must have pulled that out.
Yes,
from
that's in your conclusion. Yeah.
That's in the conclusion. So I think that's a difficult and probably a bit more loaded word than it could be. I think it's referring back to the measures that people have found that show correlation. So there's never causality or anything. It's a correlation to show that you're from, you have this certain genetic loci, and you have a higher relationship with having more education in years, or having a higher occupational status, or more income and wealth. But, as Sam on your panel and others have shown, a lot of this is just being born at the right place in the right time, and it's passed on over time.
Sam, what do you make of this?
Super fascinating work. I think really careful work. I was reading a fantastic thread on Blue Sky about the paper. I mean,
by one of its authors, I think I saw that too.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff, as Melinda mentioned, it does make you queasy because of the history around eugenics. I think the point, and she was right to sort of be cautious around terms like good, and I think talent too, because I think the point that is coming out here both is the symbiotic relationship between the sort of genetic and the social, but also this sense in which what we value in society is a social construction, even to the point of occupations, right, and education to some extent. The things that we think of as signs of intelligence, or the type of work that we think is more valuable than others, is to some extent a socially constructed phenomenon.
In the time that we have left, I want to kind of put class to one side. We've bothered at it enough, haven't we? But I wonder if we can think of any new ways of classifying ourselves? Any new dividing lines? I'll suggest some, but do pitch in these things that may be more important to us now. City and country, David.
Yes, certainly. And in fact, listening to what we've just been hearing, I was thinking, of course, in cities, it's where there are enormous mixes of people, in the terms we've just been hearing, enormous genetic mix, but equally there are parts of this country where still you can trace gene lines back for thousands of years because the population has not moved much. That's a really big difference. I would add, if I may, though, to your list, age. I do think age matters more than it used to. The gap between the generations is getting wider economically, and and more work is stratified between different age groups, less interaction between different ages outside the family.
So town and country, young and old. Lisa, what do you think? Tesco and Waitrose?
Lidl and Asda, please. But yeah, I suppose it's travel, isn't it? It's international. So thinking about my family was entirely white until my generation, and now with Black and East Asian and Portuguese and even Scottish people in our family. So thinking genetically, that mix of things, more cosmopolitan, I suppose, how cosmopolitan you are.
Can anybody throw any more in? Melinda?
Yep.
I'm Canadian, so we don't, class is a really British thing.
Yeah.
Hung for the whole hour. It's a very British thing. And I mean, but our incoming prime minister is talking using ice hockey references of elbows up and gloves off, which the rest of the world doesn't understand either. But,
so if this show was on Canadian radio, it'd be 3 minutes long, would it, you mean?
Yeah.
Sam?
It's got to be wealth. We have to talk about wealth. Wealth is having such a sort of increasing power in stratifying. We live in an asset economy, and increasingly your life chances are shaped by the wealth that you have access to via your parents.
And by the way, your parents condition you to seek out a mate who will help you keep the wealth. In France in particular, the bourgeoisie, what we call the bourgeoisie, is expert at doing this, at deep conditioning, so that you end up falling in love spontaneously with someone who's exactly of the right
Don't
background.
fall in love with money, but love where money is, as
Absolutely.
Barbara Cartland's mother said to her. Liberal and populist, David.
Yeah, that is a big divide. And of course, the populists think that being liberal is somehow not authentic and not real and cosmopolitan and rootless, which is, I think, an unfair characterization of just a different view of the world.
What do we think about that one? Obviously that one is hot in France, isn't it, Muriel?
It is hot in France. It's also hot where my husband's family is from, which is the Midlands, which I got to know a little bit over the years, over the 30 years that we've been together, where populism, I see it incarnated in people I know over there in Mansfield, to name the place. And these are not bad people. They're just from somewhere. They're from somewhere and they feel abandoned. So I think getting back to wealth and how unequal it is. That's a thought.
It doesn't mean that having moved somewhere and being in London is not a betrayal. It's not somehow means that you have lost your moral integrity.
No.
What do you think about this line, Sam?
The
liberal and populist. Is that increasingly important?
I think so. I mean, I think these two have sort of covered it. It's huge. It's hugely powerful. Yeah.
Any more? North and South. Lisa.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, as the professional northerner, definitely, and I recognise what Muriel says about Mansfield, that idea of you are much more authentic if you stayed in the same place and your family have stayed in the same place, which is ridiculous. Really.
Okay. Well, there's a dividing line that we can't avoid here, and I can see it looming on the studio clock. So let me thank Sam Friedman, Lisa Holdsworth, Melinda Mills, David Willits, and Muriel Zagha, and the producer, Lisa Jenkinson. Free Thinking now takes a short break, but we'll be back after Easter. We're hard-working, but we're not that hard-working.